Well, we're continuing in our story in the Old Testament as we've been tracing what God has done. And today we hear the story of the prophet Elisha. That's with an SH, not Elijah with a J. Actually, Elisha was the protege and the successor for Elijah. And we hear the story today of how Elisha heals a Syrian general by the name of Naaman. And before we talk about that a little bit, let's just track the story that we've been following in the Old Testament all along. We began this year learning about Noah and human sinfulness, and this amazing story of how God's love overcame his anger for humankind and its sinfulness. And then we talked about how God chose this man Abraham and gave him these incredible promises that they would be a great nation and a great people, and that they would be blessed so that they would be a blessing to the whole world. And we saw how that came true through Israel, who had 12 children, and then Joseph, one of them, who brought the children to Israel and then eventually grew there and multiplied and became, that first promise became a great nation, as many as the stars. And then we saw what happened at the Red Sea and the Exodus and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And then after that, the conquest of the promised land under Joshua. And through all these things, we see that God is with them and leads them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then before they enter the promised land, the people make a covenant to worship God alone and to keep separation and not take up the Canaanite gods. And then came the golden age of God's people under King David, who was not perfect, and King Solomon, who for all his wisdom was very dumb at the end of his life. Solomon was so smart and yet became so foolish. He overbuilt and overspent and taxed the people beyond what they could bear. And worst of all, in this clever scheme to keep the peace with other nations, he married scores of foreign wives and allowed them to bring their own gods and their own temples inside Israel. And so Israel lost its purpose, which was to be the bearers of the name of the one God. And so when Solomon died, we see the result of his foolishness. His greedy sons fought for the spoils, and out of that came civil war, and the nation was divided into two. The northern half kept the name Israel, and the southern half called itself Judah. And it was hard enough defending yourself in that region, being a big nation, but to be divided in half made survival even worse. And when you add to that what followed, the fruits of a succession of kings in both kingdoms who were involved in assassinations and family murders, and who turned from God to the worship of Baal and Moloch and Astarte, the fate of the nation seemed to grow darker and darker. And yet, again and again, we see God working, raising up isolated prophets who were at the time often weak and alone and ignored, but who continued to be a light in the fading darkness. And so Elisha the prophet comes on the scene, and he comes on at the end of the reign of one of the worst kings of all of Israel, King Ahab and his treacherous wife Jezebel. And so it's kind of like when Elisha comes on the scene, ding dong, the wicked witch is dead. There is a wonderful sense of joy about Elisha's ministry. His name means Eli, which is God, and Shua, which means salvation. And so his name means God is my salvation. And his coming is it kind of prefigures, it's a lot like Jesus coming, because we have this sense of the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good tidings. Elisha is a prophet who is filled with signs and wonders, healings, raisings from the dead, paying off the debts of poor widows, bringing rain when Israel's soldiers are dying of thirst. He's a sign of joy, a sign of the Spirit of God alive and rescuing people during some of the darkest of times. And today, as a sign of God's living word and comfort, today he heals a man of leprosy. But the important thing, I think, to remember in this is that the man he heals is also an outsider. He is not an Israelite, but someone who is actually fought battles against the Israelites. And yet God shows his love and his care. And so today I'd kind of like to just look at this and just sort of read the text again. And I'd just like to point out a few things that you might think about as we go along. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. And if for a minute, as I read this, if you could form a picture of what kind of how you would imagine this general to be. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him God had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier. So do you have the picture? This is a great man, a general, a man in control, a man who was comfortable with power, a man who seemed to have it all together because he's winning great battles. And so we have this wonderful story of this wonderful man, and then comes these very short words. But he had leprosy. Isn't it amazing? A man who is in complete control, but who has something he can't control, right? Kind of the human story of tragedy that we hear again and again. Oh, he was a wonderful man, he did all these, but he was human, but he had this weakness, but he had this problem. He thought he was in control, but he discovered there was something he could not control. Now, bands of raiders of Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of leprosy." And I know this is one of Marissa's favorite parts, because throughout this story, there are these incredible advocacy people, people who speak for other people. And the fact that this little slave girl had the courage to just say to Naaman's wife, if he would just kind of, I know this man in Israel, this prophet, and if he would just have the courage to go see this man, he would be, right? Now, she didn't have to say that. And his wife didn't have to communicate that to her husband. And yet, all of these people have a place in the story, and each one of them has an important part in what happens. I often think, when we're praying for things, and we say, well, gee, I really want an answer to this, and why won't God help me right away? And we're waiting and saying, why doesn't this occur right away? And yet there are all these other little stories that are a part of this plan that God is working out. That it isn't just it doesn't go from A to Z, but it has to go to A to B to C to D. And it's amazing to see how God sometimes works his plan through all of these little things. And it's also amazing to realize sometimes you and I are like the B or the C, that we can play some little part. And we say, I can tell my master's wife all about Elisha, but what difference does it make? He's not going to do anything, and yet she has the courage to do that little thing, and the wife has the courage to do her little thing, and suddenly all of these little things begin to come together. So Naaman went to his master, and told him what the girl, he listened. I mean, he didn't have to listen to this girl, but he listened, right? What the girl from Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, "By all means go. I will send a letter to the king of Israel." And the thing I like about this, again, in this story is how this story is about how God works through connections, right? One of the reasons that we say, I can't be a Christian all by myself, is because often it's through a community of people. One person says something to another, and this person says, well, I can contribute this little bit. And, I mean, as we work on the container project, it's amazing how the word of mouth is getting from one person to another, and one person, well, I have this, and I know about this, and this person can be able to do this, and this person can be able to do this, and all of these little separate pieces somehow come together. That's why as a church, we often can do so much more together than we ever could do separately because of all these connections that God makes between us that are just incredible. That's what happens here, that God works through all of these connections in order. So, Naaman, who went through the proper channels, goes as an emissary to the other king and has official letter of documentation. I'm sending him here for you to heal him. And of course, right, the letter he took to the king of Israel read with this letter. And this is a very polite, nice letter. I'm sending Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy. And as soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me?" Well, there's kind of a little bit of humor. Because here you have the king of Israel is clueless, right? But the whole part here is the little servant girl knew about Elijah. Everybody else seems to know about Elijah. And here you have the king of the nation who is clueless about God and clueless about the fact that there is this prophet who's been going all over the countryside healing, who's there, but this guy, how is it sometimes that we can get so high up that we lose connection with God and lose connection with the people who are involved in God around us? And in this case, thank goodness though, Elisha takes the initiative. When Elisha heard, the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent this message. "Why have you torn your robes?" Don't you get it? Don't you know who I am? I'm a man of God. I can do this. Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. You don't seem to know that there's a prophet in Israel, but he will know there's a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and his chariots, and he stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Now, of course, this is a great man. He's a great foreigner. He's a great general, right? It's kind of like, Bill Clinton is coming to your door, right? Okay, he's coming to visit you, and what does Elisha do? Elisha sent a messenger to him. He didn't even bother to see him. Why? Well, first, because Elisha is not impressed with power. And second, because it's really time, literally, this man came off his high horse. God lifts up the lowly and puts down the proud. So Elisha sends a messenger to say to him, "Okay, go wash in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be fine." Nuts. Crazy. What? You mean you're not going to come up to me and kowtow to me and then put your hands on me and hallelujah, you're healed, right? wash in the Jordan 7 times and you'll be fine. Sometimes God asks us to do crazy things. Things that kind of annoy us or tick us off. Why, Lord, are you asking me to do that? I don't want to do that. Now, why? Can't you just make it something simple and straightforward that I like and I'm familiar with? Have me do that, Lord. Why are you making me do this crazy thing of go wash in the dirty Jordan River 7 times? That's nuts. Right? For Christians, of course, this is a prefigure of baptism. This is an early picture of the fact that we go into the river, and leprosy was a death sentence. When you had it, first people wanted nothing to do with you, and you became socially isolated, and then eventually it just destroyed your fingers, your toes, and eventually it was a death sentence. There was no cure, there was no treatment for it, you just died. So this was a man who was already dead. And that's what we say about baptism. We are already dead in our sins. And yet we go into the water and we come out whole and cleansed. But of course Naaman is not thrilled about this. In fact, he's ticked. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought surely he would come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord and wave his hands over this spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Potiphar, the rivers of Damascus, far better than these dirty waters of the Jordan? Couldn't I wash in them and be clean? So he went off in a rage. Sometimes God asks us to do things that are beneath us, or we think are beneath us. We walk along the street and there's a man dirty and snotty and stinky and lying on the sidewalk totally gross and disgusting. Help me! Help me! And we go, yuck, God, get me out of here. I'm not helping you. Leave me alone. You're disgusting, right? Or sometimes it's as simple as, I love my mom and she's bedfast. And so every day I have to change her diapers. God asks us to do things that are hard because they're so humbling to do them. But then Naaman's servant comes to him again. Again, it's the little people in this story who are the important ones. And they're the ones who get it, right? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The simple people seem to know what's going on, and the big people are clueless in this story. So Naaman's servant comes to him, and I love the way he puts this, My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and he became clean, like that of a young boy. So God heals a foreign man, an outsider, an unclean man, and shows him the love of God. And so, just to summarize this there are lots of other things in there, but just to summarize this, I wrote this. God often helps us through people we do not know in ways that often seem strange and confusing, that require us to be humble, that do not make sense, but which, by humbling us and stretching us, heal us. Because I think the real healing in this lesson was not just the leprosy, but it was teaching a man who was so proud to humble himself respect the voices of all the little people who spoke to him, because they were God's voice. Amen.